No. Okay. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Sugar Free Show with myself, Karen Thomson, and nutritionist Emily Maguire. We are super excited today to have Dr. James DiNicolantonio with us. He is the author of a new book called The Salt Fix, which tells the remarkable story of how salt became unfairly demonized and never before told drama of competing egos and interests, and took the fall for another white crystal, which is sugar. Welcome, James. We're so excited to have you.
I'm so happy we're doing this. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Amazing.
Hey, so James, I want to just for everybody that's listening to this, can you just give us a little bit of a background on kind of how you even came to looking at all the aspects with regards to salt?
Sure. So I've always been into fitness. I wrestled and ran cross country in high school. So I always knew the importance of salt to fitness. Like I never performed well if I didn't consume salt or if I was restricting my salt intake. So like right from the beginning, it never made much sense to me why there was this general blanket statement for all of us to cut our salt intake, especially since we can lose salt if we just consume caffeine and coffee or we exercise. We actually lose a ton of salt in sweat. So I've always known that, you know, people are different, and some people are very active and some people consume a lot of coffee, which can cause a huge amount of salt loss. It just never made sense to me that everybody should be lowering their salt intake below 1 teaspoon. And the American Heart Association actually tells everybody to eat less than basically half a teaspoon of salt. And you can lose about a teaspoon of salt by consuming just 4 cups of coffee. So to me, it just never made much sense. So when I first started researching, I was really into salt and health on fitness, and then I started looking at the evidence on nutrition. And when I started researching for the book, The Salt Fix, I got it right here. This is it, The Salt Fix.
I love the cover, by the way.
Thank you so much. That was the first question I wanted to answer was like, where did this information come from that everybody should cut their salt intake? Like, where did it stem from? And so, you know, I go through like 100-year history of quote unquote the salt wars. There was like 3 episodes, like 3 wars that went on beginning in 1904. So even back over 100 years ago, in 1904, these 2 French scientists named Ambard and Beaujard, they put 6 of their patients on a high salt diet, and their blood pressure tended to go up a little bit. And then when they cut their salt intake, the blood pressure tended to go down. And then 3 years later, another doctor didn't find those same findings. So they were like already battling in the early 1900s. And so I go through the story of Walter Kempner and his low salt rice diet, and how other authors that did better controlled studies never really found the benefits that he was showing. And I go through some other key players like Lewis Dahl, who's kind of like the Ansel Keys of salt. It's so weird that like for some reason in the 1950s, these scientists, what they would do is they would take like 5 populations, like they would select, you know, very small amount of populations, and they would draw like a curve. So they would like have a graph and they'd show, okay, as fat goes up, so does heart disease. And then so what Lewis Dahl did was as salt intake increased in 5 populations, he was saying, okay, hypertension increased. But he only looked at 5 actual populations. Ansel Keys only looked at 6 originally. And when you threw in more populations, the curve actually wasn't like this curvy linear association. And the same thing with salt. When you threw in a bunch of other studies like inner salt, there's 48 populations. And when you cut out the 4 unacculturated populations, there's actually a tendency of blood pressure to go down as people consume more salt. And I can kind of go into why that actually might occur. But so then it all really stemmed from, we're all dealing with this nutritional whiplash now because everything stems from these 1977 dietary goals. So basically all Americans were told to eat a high carb diet, cut out total fat, cut out saturated fat, cut out cholesterol, which now we're saying is completely fine. Cut out sugar, okay, that's fine, but then also cut out salt. And it was all based on expert opinion. And in fact, the 2 authors that the dietary goals mainly based their information on, they actually misrepresented what their study showed. So it was a hypothesis paper published by George Meneely and Harold Botterby in 1976. I found that paper, I read it. What they actually said is that not everyone should cut their salt intake. Only people who are eating a low amount of potassium, and only those who are genetically susceptible to the salt raising, the blood pressure raising effects of salt. And yet those nuances never translated into the dietary goals. The dietary goals basically just said everyone should consume no more than 3 grams of salt. And it got translated that 1977 dietary goals became the 1980 dietary guidelines in the US. And that low salt dogma has just been continuously updated every 5 years. No one's ever challenged it. No one ever said, geez, did we actually have any evidence to vilify salt? And we didn't, because we didn't have the first systematic review of salt's effects on blood pressure until 15 years later. So it's so that's where it all stems, is basically expert opinion back in the late 1970s.
It's actually quite crazy. And I mean, I know for me, so my undergraduate degree was in nutrition, and the cornerstone of everything was, calories in equals calories out for weight loss. Fat is what's going to cause cholesterol. And it was very much high intake of salt is what causes problems with your blood pressure. So that is kind of the cornerstones of what we have. So just to jump right into it then. So does salt cause problems with our blood pressure?
So that's a great question. So I want to separate it out into 3 different patient populations. So you have people with normal blood pressure, people with pre-hypertension, which is between 120 systolic and 140 systolic, and 80 diastolic and 89 diastolic. And then you have hypertensive patients who have blood pressure of 140/90 or above. So if you look at people with normal blood pressure, 80% of those people are actually not going to have any type of reduction in blood pressure when they cut their salt intake. And in fact, 15% of people with normal blood pressure are actually reverse responders. They're actually going to have a significant increase in blood pressure if they cut their salt intake. And in fact, when you look at that 80%, they're actually harmed when you look at heart rate and blood pressure. So the heart rate always goes up in almost anybody who cuts their salt intake. And so what my book really tries to reveal is we've just hyper-focused on blood pressure, and yet all these other surrogate markers are worsened on a low salt diet, so heart rate being one of them. And when you add up all the harms of low salt, so when you cut your salt intake, the fat storing hormone insulin goes up because insulin helps the kidneys retain more salt. So that's not good. And low salt diets cause insulin resistance, and that's been shown in numerous clinical studies. Low salt also increases triglycerides, LDL, lowers the good cholesterol, HDL, increases all the stress hormones. So noradrenaline and adrenaline, which we're only supposed to have activated if we're like going on a run real quick, chronically get elevated on a low salt diet. Do you want to leave? Sorry. And so, sorry, a pop-up came out. And so besides that, so the low salt basically causes chronic stress, and that can actually lead to adrenal hypertrophy because your adrenals are constantly pumping out aldosterone to try and retain more salt. And that can lead to issues as well. And then when you cut your salt intake, salt is one of our best ways to get iodine. And so if you have a low salt intake, you're at an increased risk of iodine deficiency, which can lead to hypothyroidism and ruin your metabolism. And that's why people who cut their salt intake can potentially be gaining more weight per calorie consumed because their insulin levels are elevated and their thyroid hormones are all messed up.
Sheesh, that's actually, so when you hear it like that and you just think the misinformation that, we've been given for so many years, like the fat, advice that we've been given to dietary guidelines through it all. So just, I think you touched upon sort of other, health disease states that can have an impact on. So what else, impacts with regards to low salt can it have in the body? So there's lots of people now cutting out salt and thinking that should be the way forward. So what other impacts can it have in the body by having a low salt intake?
Yes, that's a great question. Well, let's start with ingesting salt. So if you actually consume a low salt diet, you're at more risk of becoming deficient in salt. And what happens is, and this is going to kind of go into a little bit of how salt deficiency can lead to sugar addiction and drug addiction. Basically, your body's response to salt deficiency is to activate the reward system. That was your way of knowing that if you got the substance in the diet, you got a better reward for it, so you would seek it out and consume more of it. Unfortunately, that activation, that heightened reward system in your brain can be hijacked by sugar and drugs of abuse. So I just published an article in Vice this morning. I kind of detail all the literature about how this works. And it's actually been shown that salt deficiency can cross-sensitize over to drugs like amphetamine and make amphetamine and drugs of abuse like that actually potentially more addictive because of that activated reward system in the brain. It's crazy how the drive to consume salt when you're deficient in it can actually be hijacked by substances of abuse. So it's something that most people have never heard about, and I reveal a lot of the science in my book.
I find this fascinating. Obviously, with a background in addiction treatment, drug addiction and alcohol addiction, I absolutely think this is just groundbreaking what you're exposing and what you're talking about. And I really think it's going to have so much help across so many different healthcare industries. I want to focus on, in your book, you mentioned the correlation between salt and sugar and the positive and negative feedback systems. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the two white crystals behave completely differently. So salt has a negative feedback system where your body's taste receptors will actually flip if you get too much salt, providing you an aversion signal. It's like this built-in safety mechanism. And the reason is because salt is an essential nutrient that our body controls its levels. So it would make sense that the body's taste receptors, if it's getting too much, would flip and say, no, this is way too salty. And we've all experienced that. If we've had too much salt, we kind of cringe and we go, whoa, way too salty. Doesn't happen with sugar. That sweet tooth doesn't downregulate. It actually kicks in even more. And so you need to eat more and more sugar to get that same high. And you can see that actually throughout population intakes. When you introduce sugar into a population, consumption skyrockets. So in the 1700s, we only ate a couple pounds of sugar per person per year. And a couple hundred years later, we're at 150 pounds. Salt's actually the exact opposite. So for the last 8,000 years, we've consumed a really high salt diet because it was our best preservative for food up until the refrigerator. So salt intake's actually gone down. So in Sweden in the 1600s, we consumed up to 100 grams of salt because everything, salted cod, salted herring, salted meats, everything was salted to preserve it. And now that we have refrigeration, our salt intake is within a narrow range because the body controls its intake via that negative feedback loop. Whereas sugar, the more you consume, the more your dopamine receptors downregulate. You get a dopamine deficiency in the brain, and that can actually lead to withdrawal symptoms. And we all have kind of experienced sugar cravings, but if you talk to anybody in Food Addiction Anonymous or Sugar Addiction Anonymous, they will tell you this is a real phenomenon, and they continually need to consume sugar, and they just have to eat more and more of it. And it's also a physiological type of addiction, right? Because you get these sugar spikes and crashes. And so you're becoming hypoglycemic and you're in this perpetual cycle of having to consume sugar. That doesn't happen with salt because your body regulates levels very well.
So how can we use salt to balance out that system?
Yeah, so we should be listening to the cravings for salt, not our cravings for sugar, because the cravings for sugar are leading us towards bad health, and we know that. The cravings for salt, though, that's going to lead you to optimal health because your salt thermostat, there's receptors in the brain that control cravings for salt. They're going to lead you to the optimal amount you should be consuming. So if you're a heavy runner, and your body's going to crave more salt than someone else. So you should listen to those signals, and to consciously restrict your salt intake as if the guidelines know more than your own body makes completely no sense. So using salt to eat real food, bitter foods like greens, nuts, seeds. I mean, my kids will not eat vegetables. They won't eat nuts or seeds without salt on them. But our society is so crazy. They would rather have kids eat junk. That's because it's labeled low salt. That's like the problem. We need to like get people to not fear the salt shaker and eat real food. And I try to tell people they're so scared because they think they're getting salt in the diet. But in evolutionary times, we used to consume the whole animal, the salty blood, the salty skin, the salty organs, the salty interstitial fluid. It's all been removed. You're stuck with like this dry piece of meat at the supermarket. You have to add the salt back. So that's kind of how I use salt to reduce the need for sugar, because salt cuts bitterness. So in a way, salt can provide sweetness to your foods.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's incredible. I think what the problem is that we've been bombarded with a system where we are eating processed foods and always this combination of salt, sugar, and fat. So those three ingredients have obviously gotten a bad rap, and it's the combination of salt, sugar, and fat, right? So we can't say to people, go eat more fat, just stick more fat on your hamburger or on your French fries, because that's not going to cut it. What is the best diet, lifestyle change that people should be following when they read your book? What do you promote?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest advice I can give is just to eat real food and salt to taste. I definitely do believe in trying to limit, not over consuming red meat. I think red meat is great. I try to get it from pastured sources, but I do think some people are overdoing it, eating over 2 pounds of meat per day. I don't think that's a great idea, because basically what happens when you cook meat is iron can be released, and that can potentially lead to negative consequences if you're over consuming it. That being said, a lot of women are not eating enough red meat. I mean, women that aren't going through menopause, they need 18 milligrams of iron a day. So they need like more than twice what a man needs. So I do think that women who haven't gone through menopause yet actually might need to eat more red meat. And so I do think that there is a good balance between trying to integrate more healthy sources of fats like nuts and seeds, because they are very mineral dense. And I think a lot of people on the low carb diet sometimes forget to consume the foods that are high in magnesium, potassium, manganese, copper. And so I do think that an overall balance of some vegetable plant foods with meat and other sources like that, animal foods like pastured eggs, it's important to try to balance them out. Now, definitely I hear some people cannot tolerate a lot of plant source foods. And if that's the case, then you should go, this whole talk is about go with what your body's telling you to do. Go with what the diet makes you feel the best. And honestly, I can't stress that enough.
Can I just jump back a second as well, just when we were talking about the cravings with regards to salt? So how does someone know that they're craving salt? Like, what should they be looking out for? How do they know when to add more in or when they're depleted? Because I know that's something I've definitely struggled with until a week ago or 2 weeks ago, when I did a bit of a kind of a cleanse challenge. So we really stripped our diet back. We were looking at real foods, and I really noticed that I needed extra salt within my diet. So what and how do people recognize that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some of the common symptoms of salt deficiency in the body, basically what will happen first is generally you'll actually have either an increase in heart rate, or you'll feel really dizzy from rising from a seated or lying down position to a standing position. And honestly, this affects women more than men, and over 3 million women in the US have a syndrome called POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, where when they go from a seated or laying down position to a standing position, their heart rate jacks up like 30 beats per minute or more. It's actually a pretty fairly common problem, and their heart rate goes up, and salt is the best way to treat that. So that is one potential symptom, but also when rising from a seated or a lying down position, you can feel very dizzy, lightheaded.
I get that.
Yeah, like especially if you're like living in the heat, like 110 degrees, which you are, right? Right now, you're just sweating out salt, and you don't even realize how much you're losing. But basically, what can happen during exercise too is that you feel faint. Your heart rate is really high and racing. You just don't overall feel good. Muscle cramping, muscle spasms, those are really big signs of salt deficiency. And overtraining syndrome, where you have joint pain, that can also be caused by a deficiency of salt.
Wow. So,
yeah.
I mean, I know that the listeners are going to be asking, how do we know how much salt to do? How do we add salt into our diets? Like, what if we overdo it? Because a lot of the people that we deal with have very little touch with their bodies and knowing what they need, when they need it. Can you give us like a basic guideline? Yeah,
absolutely. I think people are using too little salt. They're like putting a few granules of salt on their food and like thinking that's enough. And it's, especially if you're working out, that is absolutely not even close to being how much you want to do before like a pretty vigorous workout. But the way I do it, so I definitely listen to my own body signals on when I need salt. And I know how much I sweat, and I know how much like I'm going to work out. So if I'm going to work out for an hour, I have like a dosing schedule in the book. So basically what I try to do is if I'm going to work out for an hour, I will kind of use like a half a teaspoon of salt or garlic salt. And I actually like taking it dry and washing it down with some water. I can totally handle that. But some people like doing pickle juice. Some people like to put their salt in lemonade or lemon juice or lime juice. Just like whatever you fancy is how you can add salt back to your diet. I try to add salt to those bitter foods. So what I'll do is I'll kind of layer my pork chops with salt, get a nice layer, cook it up really good, pan sear it, and then I'll take those salty juices and I'll just dump spinach in that salty broth. And that's one of the best ways to get me to eat more greens, is by basically creating these salty broths through the meat that I cook and adding salt to that meat.
I mean, there are many foods that I cannot handle without salt, eggs being one of them, and they form a huge part of my lifestyle. So I absolutely cannot eat eggs without salt. So this is great news for us. I mean, I remember my gran eating real food, but being petrified of salt and not adding salt to anything. And my parents are still the same. They still have this misconception that salt is really, really bad for you. It's going to cause heart disease, and it's going to lead to high blood pressure and all kinds of horrible things. So I'm thrilled that your book's out about it, because it is one of the first of its kind, isn't it?
Yeah, like I didn't have another book to go off of. Like I literally wrote the book on salt. I honestly have over 500 references in this book, and this was a huge undertaking. It took me well over 2 years to research and write this book, because no one has ever done it before. And that's why I thought that we needed this book, because everyone fears salt, like you said. We all just think that salt is going to lead to high blood pressure and lead to strokes and heart attacks. And since integrating more salt into my own life, I can tell you, I exercise way harder, way faster, way longer. So salt is your gateway to eating healthier and exercising more. It's like, why wouldn't we use this natural substance to improve our overall diet and our health? We just need to look within ourselves to find that substance. Everybody's trying to find like the best supplement or caffeine. And it's like, just look within your own body, what is the best way to improve blood circulation, and that's salt.
That's amazing. Sorry. Just one question quickly. Are all salts created equal? Can we go to the store and just buy any old salt off the shelf, or do you have a preference as to which ones are better than others?
Great question. Definitely answer that in the book. So I do think that table salt, consuming it, is better than getting none, right? Because we need this essential mineral. We need it. But absolutely, you want to try to eat more natural, like higher mineral sea salts. And actually, in the book, I go to my number one recommended salt. But what I try to do is grab salts from ancient dried up oceans, because they don't have the contamination and pollution from modern day oceans. So if you actually get a sea salt from a modern day ocean, you're getting that pollution, you're getting microplastics in that salt. And actually an article came out about that a couple weeks ago. So I'm type A personality. If I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it to the T, and I'm going to try and get the best salt. So I go for these like ancient dried up ocean sea salts that have a good amount of iodine and calcium and magnesium. Celtic sea salt is actually the highest in magnesium. So if you're someone who just doesn't like magnesium food, Celtic sea salt is good for magnesium. Himalayan salt is the highest in potassium, and it does have pretty good amounts of iodine. So that's not a terrible choice. It's just Himalayan salt is really expensive. It's like 10 times the cost as your normal table salt. So some people like to mix and match, because some people aren't getting enough magnesium, and then they grab another salt like Himalayan salt, which is a little more higher in iodine. So there is a little bit of some science to it. And I actually have like a nutrient analysis table of the most common salts broken down, telling you how much calcium, magnesium, potassium, and iodine are in there, which is really cool. And then I have a list of the positives and negatives of some of the most common salts that we consume.
Amazing. So the question I have is there such a thing then as too much salt?
Well, I guess you could probably say for the last 8,000 years, that was probably too much salt. We were consuming up to 100 grams of salt. The Romans consumed 25 grams of salt. But even looking at the standpoint from a physiological aspect of how much salt we can actually handle, studies have shown that our kidneys will just excrete even up to 10 times a normal salt intake. It'll just literally pass right out the urine. So a high amount of salt normally really isn't a problem unless you have severe damage to the kidneys and only a particular damage to the kidneys. A lot of people actually don't realize that chronic kidney disease patients spill salt out in the urine. They actually lose a lot of salt because of the damage. Actually, sugar causes damage to the tubules in the kidneys that allow us to reabsorb salt. So a lot of people are wasting salt in their urine and they have no idea. And so I go into the book, I have an entire chapter on who needs more salt. 152 references, there's so many lifestyle factors like going ketogenic, and so many disease states like damage to the intestine, where we and all these other medications and disease states that lower salt in our blood. And so that chapter is really cool. That's where most of the research is in the book.
Cool. And I think you were just touching upon it slightly there, but the one thing I wanted to look upon was soda drinks or caffeinated beverages, because there does seem a lot of links, particularly with medications that you take as well, that has a huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So caffeine is probably one of our biggest salt depleting culprits. And that's because it's a diuretic. It literally pushes out salt and water. Most people always thought it was just a diuretic, but it actually causes a tremendous amount of sodium and chloride loss. Actually, maybe 50% more loss of chloride than even sodium. But if just looking at sodium, if you consume 4 cups of coffee, you're going to lose about a teaspoon of salt in 4 hours in the urine, which is a tremendous amount of salt. We're told that we shouldn't even be consuming that much. And yet we can be losing that much in the urine by consuming just 4 cups of coffee, which is the average intake of caffeine in America. I mean, who doesn't consume caffeine? Like, honestly, from tea or coffee or energy drinks. So that depletion of salt is affecting almost every American adult and most adults in the world.
Yeah, and so just to bring it back, so the one question I wanted to look at again was, so if it's not salt that's causing the problem with blood pressure or heart disease, what predominantly is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I published a paper in BMJ Open Heart called The Wrong White Crystals, basically how we've blamed the harms of sugar on salt. And I kind of show how there's way more evidence in regards to how sugar damages our organs to lead to hypertension, cardiovascular disease than there ever was for salt. And basically, sugar hits every single organ in a tremendously negative way on your body, starting with your teeth and dental caries, hitting the intestines, causing a tremendous amount of damage to the intestines. Most people don't realize that sugar is metabolized by your intestinal cells, and there is a tremendous amount of damage that occurs when this happens. And that it can potentially lead to things like ulcerative colitis and people that have celiac disease and people who have actual allergies to nuts. When you damage the intestines, and the proteins in nuts can then come into your circulation. So all these problems that are just blamed, oh, you have this disease state, actually might be due to, no, you're actually consuming a substance that's causing this disease state. And then the sugar dramatically hits the liver, causing fatty liver disease. And that can basically, the liver starts putting out more fat as VLDL. Your LDL goes up, and there's all this damage and inflammation to the arteries. So basically, sugar is basically has been a wolf in sheep's clothing, and salt has taken all the blame. And it's really a shame. So hopefully, this book kind of gets everyone to not fear the salt shaker, and we can start putting salt back on our food again. And
do you think there's going to be change coming with the guidelines? Do you think this might be heard where it needs to be?
Yeah, no, I'm certainly optimistic. I'm hoping that the next updated dietary guidelines, the 2020 dietary guidelines, reverse it and say, okay, everyone, we had it wrong. We're actually not smarter than our own bodies. So we're not going to tell people to consciously limit their salt intake. I would love it if that would happen. I honestly have no idea, though. I mean, this has been ingrained in people's minds for over 40 years. So I think we are kind of like at a place with salt where we were 10 years ago with low carb, high fat and ketogenic diets, just starting out, just in its infancy. And I think the first best place for people to start is to read my book to really understand the benefits that salt has on their body.
Absolutely. And just to come with that, so is the book worldwide available now? Where can people get it from?
Yeah, so people can get the Salt Fix. It is nationwide in Barnes & Noble. It's also online in Target and Walmart. They can go to my website, thesaltfix.com, and purchase it from there. It's on Amazon. And then, so this is the cover for the US, the Salt Fix. And let me grab the UK cover. It's pretty cool. Actually, most people prefer this cover for some reason. I do love it. It's just like the white crystals kind of falling from the sky, which is pretty cool. So, yeah.
I like that. And that's available in the UK as well now?
That is available in the UK, yep. So you can just order it off of Amazon.
Well, we will link to everything in that, and we're coming up on time with it, but we want to ask you a question that we ask everyone. We think this will tie in nicely with the salt and the sugar. But what would be your 3 top tips for living a sugar-free lifestyle?
So my first tip is always eat real food, salt to taste, because the salt is going to allow you to use less sugar. The second tip would be to try to include more omega-3s in your diet. So many people are not getting omega-3s. So seafood, oh my gosh, seafood is high in salt. You know what I mean? It's like seafood good, but salt bad. That makes no sense. So try to integrate more seafood. And then I do think vitamin D, people are pretty deficient in vitamin D. I think that they need to eat more pastured eggs to get vitamin D, and just, don't fear the sun as well. We've kind of demonized the sun. In the same token, we've demonized salt. So
I love those. Those are absolutely amazing. So guys, we have all James's information down below. He is one of the most inspiring, fresh, new, young voices in the space. We can't wait to see what you have to offer next, James. I know you are doing quite a few amazing studies as well. So follow him on social media, buy his book, go and buy it now. He's debunking a myth which is keeping us sick and fat and addicted and everything above. So from Emily and I, we say goodbye until next time. Bye.
Thank you.